Welcome to the third webinar in our Data-centric AI webinar series. Welcome back from what I hope was an enjoyable summer break. Today, we're going to talk about data and workers' rights with Professor Gina Neff. But before we start, let me just go through a few housekeeping elements here. We will start recording the webinar shortly, and the recording itself, as well as quotes and extracts from the recording, may be shared on social media and in our communication channels. They're listed here. The webinar is in different parts. There's a presentation one, and also an opportunity for you to ask questions. There's a channel for that on Zoom. So do add questions to that channel at all times. And our team will also be available in the chat for you if you have any other queries. As I said, this is the third in our webinar series. Just a note to my colleagues in the room. So I imagine the recording would be starting at some point now, or maybe not.
I think we've started the recording.
That's fantastic. Say now I really have to be at my best behavior. So what was I saying? 3 webinars. So just for those of you who want to be reminded of how wonderful the first 2 were, or want to watch the recording, so we've put the summary here, and we'll have a slide about this at the end as well. The series of webinars is really about sharing some of our own work, but mostly about inviting world experts with their own research, with their own ideas and experience, to share important insights, recommendations, dreams about building that socio-technical infrastructure that we need for data to work for everyone in an AI context. On the slide now, we have a link to some of our most recent work, in particular a white paper about which we have titled Building a Better Future with Data and AI. This was published in June, so before the summer break. Feels like a long time ago. But do have a look at it, and if you have any feedback or questions, get in touch. Okay, so now to this webinar. I am Elena Simperl. I am the Director of Research here at the Open Data Institute, and I also lead the Data-centric AI program that hosts this webinar. And today I am absolutely delighted to welcome our third speaker, Professor Gina Neff. Gina runs the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge. Her research is absolutely amazing, award-winning, focusing on how digital information is changing our work, not just our work, but also our everyday lives. And among many things, Gina led a team who won in 2021 Webby for the Internet Best Educational Website called the A to Z of AI, which has reached millions of people in many different countries, 17 different languages. This is in a world where we are rightfully concerned about how AI is reaching globally. Gina and her team show how things could be done. She wrote many books, including Venture Labor, Self-Tracking, and Human-Centered Data Science. And I'm sure she'll tell you more about her work in the next hour or so. So welcome, Gina. And now I hand over to you. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm looking forward to a great presentation and discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank the Open Data Institute for the opportunity to speak with so many of you. It's great to be here. It does feel like the first day back in school. I was saying some of you may still be in holiday mode, so I'm even more grateful that you're making time to talk about this important issue. If you'll bear with me a moment, I'm going to share. This is always the true test of the webinar, if you can get everything going. So I'm Gina Neff. I run the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. And not only is it back to school, but today is my first day as the Professor of Responsible AI at Queen Mary University London, where I am taking up a chair at the Digital Environment Research Institute. So forgive me if I'm making my way around Zoom in a new way, like asking where our food stores are. Okay, so we're here to talk about workers' access to data. Now, when I was thinking about putting this webinar together, it was actually really inspiring because I'm such a fan of the work that ODI does. I'm such a fan of how you're advocating for both data standards, data in an AI world, and also access and ability to use and get data in different ways, data for research, data for individuals, data for openness to be able to build and rebuild systems in new and innovative ways. But I want to bring up what I really think is a missing link. So I make the argument that we're in the middle of one of the world's largest ever social experiments, that this rollout of AI into workplaces is happening extraordinarily fast. And there's something really key missing in our discussions about the impact of AI. So when we think about what's shaping AI, how will AI develop? We often miss how people make choices around these systems, how those choices then transform the technologies and what we do with the technologies in our everyday life. So will AI lead to more worker surveillance, for example? Will these systems help to outsource misery and harms onto others? Or, can we bring a larger supply chain of data and workers into the kinds of protections and benefits that we enjoy in the UK, Europe, and the US? Can we feel some sort of solidarity with people whose labor we can't see in these AI systems, but the fruits of that effort we enjoy every time something appears to be automatic? And here I'm thinking about Mary Gray and the work on ghost work, of all the human effort and labor it takes to make AI systems. So one of the things that's been motivating my research over the last few years has really been the agency, and I would argue the neglected agency, of people who work with AI tools. And the thing that we're missing is how people need new technologies to do their jobs, the choices they make with, and yes, how they adapt those tools. And then, well, I will argue how they change the work practices, cultures, norms, and yes, laws and regulations around them. So if AI today represents one of the greatest experiments that the world as a social experiments the world's ever faced, are we missing how and who is doing the work of this change? Now, I think the stakes are pretty high because there's simply too much that we don't know. Will AI systems damage women's standing in the workplace or the standing of people in marginalized communities? Will job hiring algorithms be biased against people? The evidence suggests that these systems aren't going to produce fair social outcomes without work and effort. Will communication software that helps professionals, like email and sales coaching software, be biased against the people who use them? again, emerging evidence suggests that we have work to do to make sure that the systems fit our workplaces rather than expecting our people to quickly and rapidly adapt to them. Now, in short, there's much we don't know, and yet this development of, and I would say, again, experimentation continues apace in people's jobs and in their work. So AI is talked about in terms of job loss. It's talked about in terms of citizens and consumers, but what we're really missing is how AI matters within workplaces. And in the UK, I think this discussion is politically, it's right at its moment, because the hot topic of September 4th is rolling out of AI in public services. And if we're not talking about who is doing those jobs, how they understand the tools, what they're going to do with the tools, and how they're changing their practices to make the tools work for them, then we're missing a really big opportunity, and I would say a piece of the puzzle. So why workers' access to data matters so much. I want to talk with you today about three kinds of ways that we really see that access helps us to think through some of the challenges of data-centric AI and some of the possibilities of the potential benefits. So first, we need to remember that workers are literally at the coal face of where AI systems are being used and automated decisions are being made. So workers' access to data matters because there is increased risk, increased socio-technical risk from these systems. And we're expecting people to stand in the loop. We're expecting workers to be in the loop in terms of mitigating those risks. The second thing I'm going to talk about is how do we maintain our existing legal protections in a data-centric AI world? So this is, I think, a not insignificant question. And it's a question that different jurisdictions, different legal jurisdictions have taken up in different ways. So on the one hand, we know the EU has taken up a more omnibus approach to the EU AI Act and the Digital Services Act and other approaches to legislation. In the UK, here we have taken a sector-based and a relatively parsimonious approach to AI regulation. So if we're going to take the UK's approach, given I'm sitting here in the UK, I'm assuming some of you are sitting here with us in the UK today, we're going to take the UK approach. What does that mean for our existing legal protections and rights in the employment space when we increasingly have these rights of data? So we might not have expected people to be able to have access to data about them held by their employers in the past. Is AI changing that? Is data-centric AI systems actually changing how we think about how we would exist today's law? And then the third thing I want to talk about with us today is really innovation and adoption at the coal face of change. So this is work that's coming straight out of my next book, and I'm really excited to share it because I haven't had the chance to share it with many people yet. So hopefully it won't have suffered from the summer holidays. Okay, first let's talk about this first set of challenges. And I think these may be the challenges that most people on this call will be most familiar with, right? When we think about AI, data-centric AI systems, the potential for bias, the potential for discrimination, the potential for rights to be violated and harms to be felt by everyone, but especially felt by people in marginalized communities. When we think about that, one of the mitigating factors has always been ensuring that automated systems have humans in the loop. When we bring an approach that reminds us that it's happening in workplaces, we then replace this image of a standard human with actually somebody in a workplace, in a job, with particular kinds of rights, responsibilities, and challenges. So I would say there's three things that we need to be really mindful of here. And the first is preserving the accountability of people for harms from automated systems. Again, this is not particularly straightforward as these tools get integrated into so many different aspects and part of our lives. So when we have very long supply chains of data, very long supply chains of models, very long supply chains of services and applications built on um, uh, uh, foundation models, we need to ensure that people continue to be able to be held accountable for decisions that bring harm. Research at the Data and Society Research Institute in New York has called this the moral crumple zone of really when we use AI as a set of tools or rights or responsibilities that simply say, it's not my fault, computer says no. In this country, again, in the UK, we've had an extraordinary, I think, in 2024, we have had an extraordinary conversation around those rights and responsibilities in workplaces and preserving that accountability of people being able to both contest when data is used against them and being able to challenge those and hold accountable those who have caused harm. Perhaps those abilities now in this particular moment rest on the ability to get access to the data that helps make those cases. The second thing to remember when we're thinking about workers in the loop as mitigating these risks from AI, these potential socio-technical risks from AI, is that we have skilled workers in the loop. We have people who are able to make assessments and judgments. And as we're rolling out technology, particularly when we're looking at technologies for public benefit, as we're rolling out these technologies, we need to remember that preserving the skill of people using the systems is actually quite high. So studies done at Cornell, for example, looked at the amount of effort it took to get junior surgeons to be able to do very basic skills with the introduction of robotic surgery. So robotic surgery has been great. We see great outcomes, but we need to also ensure that we're not cutting off our training loops by those kinds of things. The same kinds of questions are being raised in legal services, where automated discovery has created some of the shortened pathways for new entrants into legal careers. And in accountancy, where the same thing has happened, automated accountancy will reduce the training opportunities, even though we still need people to go through those pathways. So figuring out how to preserve the skill of humans in the loop and workers in the loop isn't a non-consequential task. It's actually something quite significant that we need to be doing. The third and final thing I think is that remember that people are bringing a kind of oversight to the operation of these models. I think in a ChatGPT world, we were really clear on the fact that, user beware. You need to, in large language model applications that are available to the public, people need to be active in thinking about how they bring oversight. But this is true for any kind of AI system, right? Who's bringing oversight to the data and who's accounting for and watching model drift? So in a paper that we had 2 years ago on healthcare data, we talked about data work. We talked about who's doing the work of data, the kinds of jobs in the healthcare sector that were seen as paraclinical, but actually end up having an enormous role to play when hospitals are building AI systems. So making sure the data is right, making sure that patients understand the data access rights, making sure that all of those kinds of things that can cause data and models to drift over time, that there's actually people in the process working in their jobs that they do this. We can come back to this one if there's time. So The challenge is, though, we can make all of these great arguments about why workers' access to data under existing law. We can make all these great arguments about workers' access to data being really important for their being able to do these jobs. But workers don't really have access to data under existing law. Now, individuals under GDPR have the right to their data. And we've thought about data access really in a consumer model, right? That our relationship with these data economies is about us as the potential buyers of goods and services or getting these services. But GDPR has been being used as a way to ensure that people's rights at work are being preserved and protected. So, for example, the ICO has issued guidance around surveillance about workers, and that workers should know when AI systems are being used. But that guidance has been issued to employers, so it's seen as the employer's rights as data processors, not necessarily the rights of workers to the kinds of data that's held about them. And this question of access to data has not been raised. Now, one of the reasons why these access data questions might be interesting from the point of view of workers is because, well, as workers, we're collective, not just individuals. So for example, if I want to, say, reanalyze data about gender pay gaps at universities, I'm going to need to have more data than just my own. I'm going to need to have collective data. So the questions around how systems are functioning and whether or not they're discriminatory or biased, or whether or not they're providing certain kinds of support in workplaces, or those questions might best be answered as collective data questions, not simply about my own personal data. Now, according to analysis that we've done in my center, and I'm grateful to my senior technology policy advisor, Dr. Anne Christine Glenster, on this point, these new rights to data access at work could be linked to the government's proposed public register of AI tools and to the work of the Responsible Technology Adoption Unit. So there's a framework for how government are talking about data access in the UK that fits with how we might talk about workers' access to data. So the next 2 points will help me. Remember, I had 3 points. This is point 1. The next 2 points will help us understand a little bit more, I think, about what can be done when people have access to that data. And I promise not to hold us past because we've got things to talk about. So the one thing that we've been working on at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, along with our partners, is really thinking about how workers help to maintain existing legal protections and employment rights. So workers, if we think about workers as a data steward themselves, they are the ones who are helping think about the rights to employment rights under existing law. I want to say a little bit more about what I mean about that. So over last academic year, so starting exactly a year ago today, and culminating in publishing in early May, we worked with the TUC, who really led this process built out of deep consultation with their members. And what our group did was to help co-convene with the TUC, a multi-stakeholder group that included many different kinds of voices across political parties, across different perspectives, to really say, okay, what should an AI bill have in it? And the result, and I have the link, and I'll make sure that the link goes out in supplemental materials that go out from the DI. But the link really was to have, was published with an eye to supporting legal analysis for regulatory change. So it is not an accident that the bill is called Artificial Intelligence Regulation and Employment Rights Bill. So we wrote an AI bill. which is kind of crazy, but we did. We wrote an AI bill for the UK. And what we did, we took at its base, we took the previous government's exam paper to heart, which was no new omnibus AI regulation. AI regulation should be done within sectors and it should be fit within existing law. So we asked ourselves, what's going on in existing UK employment law that we might want to change in a data-centric AI world? And this is what we came up with. So first is basically there are no definitions of AI. Key definitions are missing in UK law. So it's great to talk about some of these things, but in terms of regulation, getting some fundamental definitions, what is AI, what are automated decisions, etc., that work needs to be done. We talk a lot in our circles about explainability, observability, and transparency of models. What does that mean operationally? And certainly, what does that mean in regulatory operations? So we actually wrote out what we mean in terms of that for workplaces. Sorry. There's a couple of missing things. I'm going to blame it on holiday. Okay. We completely redline emotional recognition technologies. Ask me in the later why that is, but there's 2 letters in the alphabet. One is B and one is S. Emotional recognition technologies, we just said, have no place in the workplace. Having discriminate, one of the key rights, 2 of the key rights, and in this bill are establishing a right to human review of high-risk decisions. So making sure that these systems don't discriminate, provide employment discrimination. But if they do, that workers have a right to human review. Now, human review is not needed in current employment law because it's assumed that all decisions about hiring and firing are made by humans. That's a kind of thing that needs to be in place because of this world. And then I think most interesting for this discussion is really novel rights to the sharing of collective data held by workers at work. Now, in the case of how this bill was written, this was about these high risk and employment based decisions. But we can imagine, and I would argue, there's really good reasons why workers' rights to access to data in the workplace can help spark innovation. Stay with me. So my last and final point, and I'll try, and this is where we're getting into the book, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly, really is around how workers are at the coalface of innovation and adoption in technological change. Remembering that the automatic processes that we see in work and in these technologies, they're never automatic, that they're always a function of people fitting these systems into place. And that people, they really are the best judge of context and change. So when we have new tools, and I'll get a little more concrete, when we have new tools in place, people are really good at understanding what they might be good for, what the rules and contractual obligations they may have around those rules. They're really good at thinking through this process and stitching together what the tools can do for them and what they need to be doing at work and what their rights and responsibilities are. And then really long-term success at technology adoption. And this is technological change 101, right? Long-term success at technology adoption really requires significant organizational and cultural change. And this is the point that gives me a little bit of and here's the formal term, heebie-jeebies. Like, I get a little nervous when I hear government talking about, let's throw AI out at systems and we're going to just get productivity, because I've seen it before. Where did I see it? I saw it in construction. So for 15 years, 16 years, We just had a birthday. For 16 years, I have been working on studying large scale construction and digital change. You can ask me how I know it's been exactly 16 years. The book that's coming out of that project finally is drafted, and we are calling it Negotiated Innovation. And we think it's really much better than a framing of automation for thinking about how technology change is made in practice. So spending time with construction workers on large scale projects where they're trying to bring in a tool that automates a narrow sliver of the construction planning process, and watching all the work that gets done. And these are data workers, right? These are guys in hard hats like the ones in this picture I took. They're staring at screens. They're trying to figure this thing out. Did the automation journey that they started almost 20 years ago, has it led to magical productivity? I hate to break it to you, but it did lead to other things and great benefits, but not without a significant and enormous amount of change. Now, instead of automation, here's the model of the book. This is for the social scientists in the room. I'll speed through this. Really, we can focus on people's practices around this change. And I think when we watch workers with these technologies, we start to learn really new and exciting things. So people have to make sense. This is the Carl Weick, the organizational psychologist. This is his phrase. Like they sense make, they have to figure out what is going on. And we are all collectively in a process of sense making around large language models and what the heck is going on with them right now. We change and shift our expectations around what they might be able to do for them. And the hype in the air, that sort of Gartner hype cycle, really becomes part of shaping our expectations of what we think the tools might be able to do. The next step is really putting these things into practice. And we do that through a series of negotiations with ourselves, with our teams, with our groups, with our companies. We really try to figure out, okay, where are the places where our practices need to change? My type of work needs to change. And where's the benefits? Where's the cost of this change going to benefit me? And then finally, we come to negotiating these changes. Sometimes that means changing the law, changing norms of practice, changing loads of things. So thinking about this as a process that happens within the workplace, I think is a really powerful way for thinking about how innovation will happen. It's a bit that's missing, I think, from how we're talking about large language models, but maybe this year will be different. Oh, I'm going backwards. Okay, so what should we do? Final slide. Literally, what are we going to do? I think we have to plan for workplace impacts, not just worker displacement, right? We've really got to think about how people are working with this data. Access to data will help in terms of thinking about workplace impacts and making workplaces more effective. Realizing that safety in an AI system really is relying on workers in the loop. We've got to help design for this. We've got to make sure that the people who need the access to data to help keep us all safe have that access. Remember, data are plural, so are workers. We need access because we work in collective units, not just as individuals. And then finally, I think we're building capacity for AI transitions, and that's human capacity, skilled capacity. We really need to be able to rely on how people innovate within their jobs. And my strong call to everyone here watching this webinar is that people innovating in their jobs need the data to do that. Let's figure out how we can build the systems, regulatory, technical, and cultural, that give them the access to the data that they need to help make themselves more productive. And with that, I will just remind you that I am still at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. And I think, Eleanor, may have some questions for me.
I do, indeed. Thank you so much for this. And while I will try to share my screen, let me just start with a fun question. So how did you know it was exactly 16 years? Tell us
So,
that and I'll do my slide.
oh, yeah, no, I fed you that question, didn't I? So, the day we were negotiating in the United States, you negotiate with what's called the Institutional Review Board to do human subjects research, and we were negotiating this first large National Science Foundation grant that we got to support this work. My co-author, Carrie Stosic, and I. And I had a call scheduled with the officer at the IRB the moment that my doctor came into the room and said, Mrs. Neff, that's what they call you in labor and delivery. They were like, it's time to wheel you into labor and delivery to deliver your twins. So literally the project started the day my 16-year-old twins were born, and their birthday was yesterday.
Congratulations.
I know, it's time to finish the book. The book is finished. They are not.
Well, that's another project. Wow, very impressive. Great context, really.
What's even more impressive is that my co-author, not 9-10 months later, also had twins.
Mhm.
So this book has been 2 twin moms.
All important milestones of the
Yeah.
project, no doubt. I'm going to start this off just with some general questions, as I was telling you before we started. So it's my little Christian questionnaire for the webinar series, and you were saying rightfully so that we need to be clear about what AI is and isn't, if we're talking about regulation. Now, I was just wondering what your thoughts are about what data-centric AI is, and what it means for you and your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I've used the term data-centric AI. However, in the human-centered data science book, which I co-wrote and was published 18 months ago now by MIT Press, we make an argument that it's hard to find a data system that isn't touched by humans. And let me explain. That's an organizational social scientist for you, right? That data aren't just found. It's not oil. Data are not oil. Data are hydropower, right? We build systems to harness data. We manipulate data. We work with data. Data don't just appear. Data are structured. And most importantly, I think people tell stories about data. And sometimes those stories are quite scientific, and sometimes those stories are a little loopy. But the stories people tell with data are very much about how we build relationships and narratives with each other. And so for me, data-centric AI is about how we use data in large-scale ways to make things that appear automatic. I know there's all kinds of these definitions around AI as automatic, but I'm never willing to give a kind of complete automated agency to these large scale systems because there's so many human decisions that go in at every step of the way.
Fascinating. There's also, and I suppose, this also reminds me of some of the ongoing work we're doing, which we haven't published yet, where we're actually going a step further, say, and unpacking what data are we actually talking about? Is it the training data? Is it the fine-tuning data? And yes, it's all that, but it's also the code books and the dictionaries and the background knowledge bases and the data about the ecosystem. So some of this collective data that you were talking about is actually data about the use of a system, both by an individual and an organization. So thank you so much for that. Questions are coming in. I'm just going to pick one more question from my little questionnaire. And do you think something has changed since November 2022. So since we had ChatGPT, we talk about frontiers and foundations models. How do you think about the role of data in the models and systems and ecosystem that AI has created since then?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, it's funny because in the imagination, I think in some ways this may be a cop-out answer, but in the public imagination, large language models are not data heavy. And for those of us on this call and who really care about data, and I've heard wonderful presentations from Nigel Shadbolt about this, this is enormous amounts of data and data processing. And one of the things that I think for me is really telling is that we've got this seemingly more human or humanizing interface for non-technical people to be able to interact with AI systems in the form of a natural language interface laid over enormous amounts of data. The thing that worries me is that, we know the science is out on whether putting more data into large language models gets us better results. So that there is theoretically an asymptotic effect where we'll approach something that looks good enough, but we'll never get there. And at what cost when we hear the sheer energy demands that are being put forward by the builders of foundation models, when they can say non-ironically that they will happily take the entirety of the US electricity grid to power the development of their models. We have to ask ourselves, how much data is enough? And is this the right approach to powering the transformations that we know societies can have?
Yeah, and as it happened, I was talking to someone earlier today about this. So where is this all going? And I was saying that if you go to AI conferences, academic conferences, so there's major events where thousands and thousands of researchers are presenting their latest research in AI models and so on and so forth. And a big part of that conversation is the fact that the majority of the community is trying to incrementally innovate over what we have right now. And there is a growing understanding that whatever the solution is going to be, it's potentially not the architectures that we have right now. So when people aside all these concerns about electricity, about data access, and the sort of incentives this sort of models create, we need different technical solutions. It's not going to work. Even if you would have access to the whole grid, you're not going to get where you want to go. Anyway, I'm going to move us now to the sections.
And there's so many good questions in the Q&A tab, and it's down in the bottom of your screen.
Yes, I know.
I just wanted to say, she told us so, and the collective she's, the stochastic parrots paper out of Google saying, guys, large language models will only get us so far because of the conceptual challenges that LLMs represent. Now with the work that's coming out on model collapse, the theoretical approach from a linguistic point of view is seeming really prescient. I mean, it's going to take a lot of energy to get us to a place that may not lead us to where we want to go.
Exactly. All right, let me just give justice to some of those great questions in the Q&A and keep them coming. And if we don't manage to get through all of them now, we will make sure that we answer them and we'll share those answers as well. So we talked about policy. So maybe let's talk a little bit about how that policy could work. So there is a question around should access to certain data be legally mandatory, and if so, what types and why?
That's a great question, right? I mean, access to certain kinds of data is already legally mandated under GDPR. You know, what we called for in the TUC bill, the AI and Regulation and Employment Rights bill that was drafted, that the link will go around to, is two things. One, that employers understand how the tools that they're using, the automated decision-making tools that they're using in the workplace, fit with the data of their workers. So they have to do audits to ensure that the tools they're using are actually fit for purpose for what they're trying to accomplish. And that in doing that kind of audit, they end up with the ability to absolve themselves of some of the liability of faulty software or decisions that were made by software companies, right? That they understand what is happening between the tools they're using and the data that they have about workplaces. Having access to that data would be incredibly, to those audits, would be incredibly useful for people in the companies where they work. That's, I think, really easy. The question, of course, that people raise is around trade secrets, or around, companies somehow benefiting off of access to data about their own workers. But, under GDPR, the courts have generally sided with the fact that individuals' rights to data override those questions of that kind of model. Like we can't. GDPR has held that you can't make that business model solely on people's access to people's data that they have their rights to. So why shouldn't that also hold for workers? It's a natural legal step. I saw that one question from Neil kind of raised the question of, many companies are adopting AI tools in order to do cost cutting. I'm like, let me tell you about 20 years of the construction industry, right? 20 years ago, the idea of introducing these tools that now we call in this country, we call digital twin or 4D modeling, building information modeling, and the suite of automating tools in planning and visualizing were the tools that I studied for the book. And the rhetoric really was, this was going to spark productivity, it was going to lower time on jobs, it was going to reduce the number of people available on work sites. And it's done a little bit of that, but it's also been a whole lot more costly than that. What it has done is created new kinds of services that have been incredibly valuable for the building sector. So there's a benefit, and now there's a reason why large-scale projects use these tools for construction planning. Did they wholesale kind of cut jobs? No. Have they allowed for more buildings to be built? Absolutely. Are buildings being built more efficiently with fewer errors, less rework, fewer cost overruns? Absolutely. So it has to be, I think we have to balance that kind of notion of cost cutting. Cost cutting for what? And I'm of the mind, so OECD and the International Labor Office have both come out with estimates in terms of the impact of AI on work. And they say that we're going to see an enormous reshifting of tasks, but not necessarily a wholesale shift in employment. So everybody's job is going to change a little bit, but we're not going to lose, quote unquote, all the jobs. And some of my colleagues in the social science and humanities are out there kind of promoting ideas that we're at the end of work. let me tell you about raising kids if you want to think about how we'll be spending our time if we get any extra time.
Thank you. And I think there was also a bit earlier a related question also about this AI and productivity context, where you talked about negotiated innovation. So the question is, how could we shift the conversation towards the process of negotiated innovation, which you've set out, and in particular, can or should tech policy join up with the labor movement and more worker-led initiatives? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, and I'll put my cards on the table, right? I truly and always believe in the power that people working with data can come up with really creative and interesting solutions. But I say this from a kind of professional science perspective, right? If you don't have the workers in the loop, your thing's not going to work. And I am wary of calls for public service. I'm not wary of calls for public service productivity and public service innovation and technology used in public service. All of those things need to happen in this country. I am wary if those conversations are not being held alongside the enormous organizational and cultural change that has to happen in order to make these tools fit for purpose. What's going to make this technology adoption more successful, what's going to make it more innovative, is a process of negotiated innovation. And in part because it's the people who figure out how to do what science and technology studies scholars call design and use, right? They are the ones who modify and redesign how these things will be used in practice, or they just don't use it. So if it's going to be successful, it absolutely has to get on board people who are going to help to make that change possible. I am very excited. I saw we have someone from New Zealand. I may or may not be entering into a project with somebody who is looking at this with data from New Zealand. And I'm very excited about that in public sector.
And we'll send some pointers to AI literacy work later on as well, because there were a few other questions about that. So now I think we have time for maybe two questions. So I'm spoiled for choice, but I'm going to start with one that I'm personally interested in very much, because one of the things we work on at the ODI, and we've been working on it for many years, is this idea of new structures, new institutions for data access. So when we were talking about this data that is created in the context of more AI systems entering the workforce, do you think we need to add data access to existing collective governance mechanisms or structures, something like unions, community groups, or do we need new things, new data institutions, new types of stewardship?
That is such a great question. And I'm just pulling up, if you can see me scrolling, it's because I'm pulling up this bit. Hopefully I have it in here. Maybe I don't. So recently the culinary union of the Unite HERE, which is the very big services and hospitality union in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the surrounding regions. The culinary workers union demanded access to data about the workers that were held by the employers. They paved the way. They did this through bargaining agreements. They asked for it in their contract and won it. And they asked for a notification of third-party processing. So which kinds of companies were processing the data? Again, rights that they would have individually, but collectively are quite useful for understanding what tools are in place. They asked in their bargaining that any kinds of tools that were processing worker data would be known to them, so they would know how how and what those tools are. I think we have many mechanisms in place. I think civil society groups, research groups like ODI, like the group I run, and others have a real role to play here in changing the public conversation about data.
Mm-hmm.
I think that unions and other civil society groups have an enormous role to play here in helping prepare people for the transition to data-centric AI enabled societies. And if we want those societies to benefit people, we're going to need the work to be done now. So I'm not sure that we need new data organizations. I think we can strengthen the groups we have by asking for these kinds of rights and really recognizing that data access rights are vital to preserving and protecting the legal rights that we enjoy today.
All right. And a final question. So we've talked about the UK and possible regulation in the UK, but you also had lots of examples from other parts of the world. So there were two questions earlier on about an international context. On the one hand, multinational companies, say how would that work for those types of companies to ensure that workers aren't having decisions made that affect them in other jurisdictions, but also a related question about international collaboration. Say the UK does the right thing, but other countries don't.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. So, listen, I am a big believer in the calls that have been put forth by the Biden White House, among other civil society groups, around what an AI Bill of Rights would look like. And I think we get there by agreeing across jurisdictions that there are some really bright lines that we think people deserve in an AI world, in a digital society. And I think some of those are the right to know that AI systems are being employed around us. That's, to me, very basic. So I do think that there'll be some international coordination. I'm very excited that the French AI Action Summit is opening a bit wider to civil society groups. And just today, there was the French envoy for that summit held a big webinar of how civil society groups are going to be involved and a part of the conversation. And that's where I think we need to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And sadly, we are now at the end of the webinar, but thank you so much for everyone for joining, for your questions. Thank you, Gina, for being here with us today. We'll share the link in the chat as well. But if anyone is interested, we've done some related work at the ODI. So similar topics to what Gina was talking about, the use of data to empower workers. So that was work we've done in a peer learning network with Humanity United, a great project that our colleague Alea coordinated. One more time, just to remind you, so this is part of our data-centric AI webinar series. And if you're interested in some of the work that we're doing, we have a newsletter. We don't spam you too much, don't worry. So typically you'll receive updates from what we're doing more or less once a month, as well as links to the recording of this and all the other webinars in the series. We will meet again in October, so October 8th, with Danny Vrandicic from the Wikimedia Foundation. So he's going to talk about data at the foundation, both data that that community of volunteers is creating and is the feedstock of AI, but also how they use this sort of technologies, followed then in November by a webinar with our co-founder, Nigel Shacbolt. And with that, thanks again, Gina, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I'll see you in a month or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.